Every now and then, I make time to interview somebody for this podcast. I haven't done many since we began this podcast, I think a little over 3 years ago, maybe 6 or 7 people. And generally, I kind of wait for my own gut or intuition to tell me, oh, this I think might be worth interviewing somebody who sparked my own curiosity and somebody that I respect. So today is one of those days, and we're going to be talking to Clare McKenna, who is one of Ireland's leading voices in health and well-being. And if you're Irish, if you listen to Irish radio, particularly News Talk FM, you'll kind of know her as a familiar presence to Irish radio. I think she brings thoughtful, grounded conversations around mental health, lifestyle, and modern well-being to a very wide audience. And I've come to know Claire a little bit through a group of colleagues who are kind of interested in, I suppose, mental health and well-being and health. And Claire recently brought out a book called Would You Be Well, where she takes a very, I think, refreshingly honest and common sense approach to health, kind of moving away from fads, quick fixes, and external noise, and I think towards something that is much more personal and certainly more sustainable. And her perspective is definitely shaped by her own journey. And over the course of this interview, we're going to talk about that. And she's going to talk about being immersed in the world of diets and fads and trends, high performance routines. And then she reached a point of overwhelm. And I can certainly relate to that myself. But she starts to question, what does being well actually mean? And what she discovered and what we're going to explore over this conversation is that I suppose real health is much more individual than most people think. And it's much more connected to how you feel than how you look. Claire's a mum. And I think that lived experience as a mum and a daughter and a wife brings an added layer of realism to everything she shares. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you do too. I'm going to loop back after the conversation. I'll give maybe my own top takeaways from this. And look, this podcast is called The Inner Edge, and very much we're about the inner game. But as you'd know, if you've listened to me, there's kind of different dimensions. There's physical, mental, emotional, and indeed spiritual. And we kind of hit on all of those areas over the course of this conversation. So I think there's a lot in this that's rich and honest and worth reflecting on. And I hope you get as much from it as I did. I really enjoyed talking to her. So as I said, I'll come back with a couple of short takeaways if you're interested. But other than that, enjoy the conversation. Claire, welcome. And what I want to do, first of all, is ask you maybe a topical question, I think, about health. I think from what I'm seeing, especially in the age of AI and huge growth in social media, influencers and channels, there's never been more information about health. Yet, a lot of people, I think, feel more confused than ever. And I'm wondering, why do you think that is?
It's very overwhelming, the information alone outside of the health sphere. They say we're taking on more information now before breakfast than our ancestors did in their whole lifetime, which is more information basically for you to take on, more mind-blowing information. And it's certainly something I felt myself, because on my own health journey, I was sort of following the diet and exercise because that's what originally was about in the 90s and the noughties. And then with the introduction of the internet and social media, that's when everything got thrown wide open, because up until then, we only really had TV, newspapers and magazines, and that was feeding it to us. And then with reality TV, everything changed. The whole landscape changed. And with the internet and social media in particular, that's when it went from being experts and a few people to being millions of people. And I felt it myself. I started trying to follow all types of trends and fads, and it just became too much. And now we have, the real person story, as I said, through reality TV and social media, but a lot of it isn't reality. So that's what's very dangerous. And you have a lot of people who are speaking about their own life. But what I have found at the other side after, exploring it myself through my radio show and through my studies and qualifications is that health and wellness is very individual. So yes, there can be information we can take from experts that can be beneficial to all, but it really is individual. So watching what somebody's doing on Instagram is not a good place to be taking your health advice. And that might sound really obvious, and people might say, well, I'm definitely not doing that. But we are really influenced and not even realizing what subliminally is going into our subconscious mind as to what's right and what's okay. So I think it's the sheer volume of it that has changed, and the fact that we don't really realize how we're taking it in. Perhaps if we had, and we still do this now, I know, read magazines, read articles, watch TV, there seems to be more of a conscious effort that we're taking in information. But with scrolling now, I don't think we realize the opinions we're forming. And I even do it myself sometimes. I can be scrolling and I say, oh, that looks like a really good show on in a theatre. I'd love to go to that. And then I scroll on and then I say, what was that show I wanted to see? And I can't remember it. So we're forming opinions without fully taking in the information. So I think it's all of that's compounding the issue.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, okay, you've mentioned there that obviously you're an experienced broadcaster, um, but you're also an integrative health coach, right? So what does that actually mean?
So, an integrative health coach is integrating lifestyle and preventative medicine in with the crisis model that we currently have. So, I often think health and wellness, or, medical science and lifestyle medicine get pitted against each other, but really they're all supposed to be complementary. So, currently we wait for something to go wrong before we seek help, and then we treat the symptoms. But what the lifestyle medicine model does is look at the way we live and how it influences how we feel and our potential health outcomes. So that was something when I started presenting the health and wellness show on News Talk, I really questioned my own health and well-being. As I said, I had been doing diet and exercise. Then the world, blew wide open with health and wellness. I was following as many trends as I could, and I found myself really overwhelmed and quite burnt out with it all. So I figured if I felt this way, other people must feel this way. And I didn't really feel like I could honestly define what wellness meant. Everyone was talking about it. This is 7 years ago now. I think we talk about it even more now. But I was hearing this word and was wondering what it really meant. So I decided to talk about it on the show and write about it in one of the Sunday papers and kind of go on the journey. And it was, what is health and wellness? And at the end of it, I really felt that it was individual. It was the very simple things in life. It was focusing on how I felt rather than how I looked, because I think a lot of it is taken up with this body ideal and looking a certain way. And because I had spoken about it and written about it, I started getting asked to host events and speak at events. And I wanted to have a qualification to back that up. So, I'm not a medical professional and I would never give medical advice. But that's why I decided to do the integrative health coach course. And that really rubber stamped everything that I was feeling and everything that I had experienced and everything that I was saying, because it looks at the areas of your life and how you're living and how that impacts on your health. So the pillars of lifestyle medicine are movement, nutrition, sleep, stress management, and connection. And obviously, you're not going to have all of those in, hitting 100% at all of the time, but they're just areas to keep an eye on. And the course that I did was with the Institute of Integrative Nutrition in, they're a New York based organization, but I did it online. And they break it down into primary and secondary food. So nutrition is in their title. So nutrition is obviously very important. And you do a lot of study around that. But they break it into primary and secondary food. And primary is how you're living your life. And
Mm,
secondary to that is what's on your plate. And
mm,
that's how important they deem it. So that's what it is. I mean, they trained us to be a one-to-one coach, but I would consider myself more one to many
mm,
through, events that I host or online courses that I have, or even, speaking right now. One to one is not necessarily something that I have the time for right now because I still have my broadcast career. But they also really drummed into us that when we are coaching people, everybody knows underneath it all what it is they need. They just need support and somebody to hold space while they get there. Now, that might be outside of the health coach. You might also need to lean on medical support or the support of a of a therapist, or a friend or a partner. It's going to be multifaceted. But, I think that's a really interesting idea as well. And the one thing I always take with me is that I never wanted to be finger wagging. I think when you talk about
Mm.
lifestyle medicine, it sort of can come with the idea that you're not doing enough. And these are all the things you should be doing. And why aren't you doing this? And I like to come from a far more compassionate approach, that we are all doing the best we can with what we've got. And it's not to make you feel guilty. It's more to empower you that with small little changes to your everyday can make a massive, massive impact.
Mm. I can relate to a lot of what you're saying because I'm probably I am somebody who would have followed certain fads myself. So, like, fat and protein diet, the Atkins diet, I would have kind of gone extreme and full on in terms of some of the training. I think probably, it's by banging your head against the wall or making mistakes or falling down, you realize, hold on a second, is there a better way? I have to say, I will compliment you on your book. I have it here in front of me. Would you be well? Like for me, as I was reading through it, I shouldn't have been because obviously I know you a little bit, but I was a little bit, I was surprised in a good way because like, it's a very, what I would call common sense approach to health that is grounded in, I think, both experience, probably of doing it one way, and then also looking at even some of the cutting edge research around lifestyle medicine, which is a much more holistic approach to overall health and well-being and wellness. And it's just very much, I think a lot of the mistakes I would have made myself in the past, I think a lot of people still do this, is where they say, look, there's one way as opposed to your way, right? And what comes across in your book is, you know, everybody has their own blueprint, is what you say, which I have to say I would agree with. But it's just done in a way that actually you're kind of encouraging people to kind of, I think the line you used was not, what you realized was health for you was not so much about looking well as opposed to feeling well. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, that was really surprising to me. So when I contacted one of the Sunday papers and said, can I write about this? Um, they said, yeah, and there were photographs, and they took the first set of photographs in a very kind of before setup, like I was taking them from all different angles in a gym, I should say, in my leggings and gym top. And I was, fully compliant with all of this. And I was, even though I knew I was going to go on a journey, and I was very much committed to the idea of discovering what is health and wellness. And I was very genuine in that. I did still have a big part of me that at the end of what was supposed to be 6 months, think of those after photos and how ripped I was going to look and how I was going to tell everybody, how
Yeah.
I got there.
All right.
And the pandemic hit in the midst of this 6 month plan. So everything, of course, slowed down and it became a year. And by the end of that year, I had done a full 180 and I had let go of all of those rules and restrictions around food. Um, I had really stopped focusing on my body in an aesthetic point of view. And I had really started focusing on how I felt, because I felt so much better when I did all of that and I started to eat properly instead of polarizing foods into good and bad categories and having food guilt and food noise. It freed up my head for so many other things. And also, as I say, when I began to eat properly, and I worked with performance nutritionist Daniel Davey, and he said, look, don't weigh anything. Don't, worry about anything. Just make sure you've got protein, fats, and carbohydrates at every meal. Don't worry about it. And, it took a while to get into it, but I do remember my shoulders coming down, that I didn't have to demonize carbs anymore and
And
that
was that,
fats were a
sorry,
good
Claire,
thing.
was that the turning point for you, that conversation with Daniel? Was that the turning point there that something dropped?
No, well, he had come on the show to talk about his book, and that had been a big penny drop moment where that was one of the times I questioned how healthy was I really. And he was talking about lean muscle mass, not as a desired aesthetic, but as a indicator of our predisposition for disease later in life. And I just had this moment where I thought, what the hell are you doing? What are you
Yeah.
doing? And obviously, the whole thing doesn't change, but it was just one little change of the cogs. Another was the dietitian Orla Walsh. She's a brilliant registered dietitian who has a real no nonsense approach. And she was on busting a few myths around nutrition. And she was talking about dairy, and I was asking how come dairy comes in and out of fashion. One week it's good, and like for you, the next minute it's not. And she said, look, at the time almond milk was the big thing. Oat milk is more of a big thing now. She said, look, some people decide to remove animal products for, their own reasons. And, that's a whole different story. But if you are picking up something you've seen on social media, she also said, look, if you like the taste more, that's fine. But if you're cutting dairy from your diet, you need to not only think about where you're getting your calcium, that's the one thing everybody seems to go for, but you also need to think about where you're getting your iodine. And she went on to, say things that, I'm not qualified to say about the importance of iodine in our diet. And again, I thought to myself, you are making health decisions on a whim without really thinking about why you're making them. So it was all of those that led to it. But I compiled a team of people to join me on that 6 months that became a year journey. And Daniel Davey was one of those. So he was guiding me on the nutrition side of things. Um, I had a team of people helping me when it came to workouts and building muscle and all that side of things. I had another couple of brilliant women who had been bodybuilders who found they had a really poor relationship then with their food and body when they came away from competition. So they set up an organization that work with people around their relationship with food and body, around the emotions we hold when it comes to food, the history we may have had through our family with food. So that was very interesting. But I think also what was really pivotal to me was in the pandemic, because I started to feel so anxious with what might happen. And that's sort of the definition of anxiety, fear and worry around what could happen.
Mhm.
I started to lean into all the practices I'd heard so much about, from mindfulness to meditation to online yoga in my bedroom to breath work. And I think we'll all remember the first lockdown was in beautiful weather, and you would go for a walk around the block and you'd come back and you'd feel better. So the situation outside hadn't changed, but I felt different and I began to build on that. So that's when the holistic ideas started to form for me. And back to the food side of things, when I started to follow what Daniel Davey had said to me, not only did I reduce the stress in my mind and have a bit more joy come into food rather than questioning what I was eating all the time. I mean, I don't think you even notice, it just becomes the way you are programmed. And I might say, well, you
Yeah.
ate that earlier, so you better not eat that. And you better go and work out later. And then what about that? All of that was
Yeah.
gone. And I had far better energy levels. I was sleeping better. I was more motivated to do my workouts. I was waking up feeling more rested. And on the days that I might let it slip back into my old habits and forget, I would feel more tired. My mood would be lower. So that's when I really started to think about what I was doing every day and how it was impacting on how I felt. And
Mm.
that was the massive change. That was the transformation. So, in the final photographs, I was just, fully clothed. There was no showing off my muscles. It was nothing about that. It was all about
It was
how I
real Claire.
felt
Real
and
Claire.
how I'd worked out what worked for me. And I always say, I never want to be this guru type person who's telling everybody, I have the secret and follow what I did. And, you too can live this perfect life that I do, because that is not the reality. My life is just as chaotic as everybody else, but I've worked out what works for me. And I never want to encourage people to listen to me. I want to empower them to listen to themselves more.
Mm. Mm. Okay. There's a lot there, what you just said. I mean, I think what's coming up as you're saying it is, I suppose, in connection to your book, there's three sections in the book, again, which I like. It's mind, body, soul. And you're bringing in one element. Obviously, look, I suppose this podcast is called The Inner Edge. So most of the time, I'm talking about something that's going on in the inner world of the person. But having said that, like, the body will have a huge effect on somebody's mind and what they're thinking, and vice versa. And then also there's the soul or the spirit. So before I get to soul, I want to ask you something about the mind. Um, Before we hit record on this conversation, you were sharing a story where you were speaking at a company, and somebody come up to you afterwards and said, they were upset. You said they were crying. They were like, oh my God, what you were saying about being hard on yourself really struck a chord with me. So what I'm wondering, first of all, is what do you do when you're hard on yourself?
Well, I was very lucky in one of my first jobs. I used to work in the corporate world for many years in marketing. And in one of the companies I worked, they sent us on personal development courses all the time. And that was pivotal to me and who I am. And I'm ever, forever grateful to the HR manager, Andrea, for doing that, because that taught me to be reflective. Um, and like this was at a time, it was like, ironically, it was Ireland's first internet company. So the internet was literally just starting.
Who was it, Claire?
Um, Indigo and
Oh yeah.
Aircomnet.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
now
Yeah.
Air. Um, and now we have like clips of Brené Brown coming into our phones. We have, thoughtful memes. We have all of that stuff coming at us every day. But I hadn't been exposed to anything like that at that time. So I would have been 20, 21 at that time. So to get this idea of taking an aerial view of your life, what's working for you, what isn't, where would you like to go, and how are you going to get there? And look, I was very lucky as well that this was me at the age of 19, 20, 21.
Hmm.
This is the early noughties where like the economy was booming. The Spice Girls were talking girl power. It felt like everything was possible. I really feel for the generation right now because it feels like in many ways the very, very opposite. And what's going
Yeah.
on globally really does have an impact in what you believe to be possible. So all of these things were playing a role, but I was sitting in front of people who were giving really inspirational presentations and stuff to us and teaching us about goal setting. And back then it was very much around capital gains and, doing well in business. But it still transferred to what
Hmm.
do you dream of and what you believe you can achieve. So I think that is kind of number one. So if I am being hard on myself, I will kind of step back from myself a little bit and I will often say, what's going on here? What's causing this? Why are you feeling this way? And I will try and think of what can I do? But as well as that it can be a double-edged sword, can't it? Because then you can constantly be looking to achieve and do better and push yourself further. Um, so there can be a bit of that going on with me as well. And I talk about it in the book, I did kind of hit a time in my life where like I jumped from the corporate world. So I sat at a desk one day, it was at another company that I had moved on to because Indigo wrapped up in the end. Um, and I was quite bored. I was quite bored. I was the PA to an MD who was a fabulous guy who I loved working for, but it wasn't really lighting my soul. And a lot of the time I'd literally be sitting at a desk waiting for him to come back to a meeting from a meeting that wasn't needed at. And I'd literally be clock watching and I just couldn't figure out like, what am I doing here? Unless I was doing something, I didn't want to be there. And I thought, well, what will I do? And I had originally done theatre studies when I left school and had favoured a life on stage, but I had realised it wasn't necessarily going to pay the bills. And I was living out of home from the age of 18 and quite independent. So that's what led me into marketing. But I thought, what am I going to do? And I thought to myself, well, why don't I do a sort of a stage as such, but why don't I just be myself? And radio and TV was something that I wanted to do. And I went knocking on doors, um, worked in a restaurant and worked my way up. But I reached a point where it hadn't necessarily worked out the way I had expected it to. I expected to, I don't know, have the Clare McKenna show and, just I mean, I remember saying to my husband one time, I just think maybe I need to be more specific on my vision board. I'm just saying I want to be a TV presenter, but I'm not being specific about the type of shows I want to do. And I was working on Ireland's AM at the time, but I used to always do cover. So it wasn't necessarily a permanent position, but I mean, it went on for 4 years. It was pretty much permanent. And it meant there was kind of flexibility so I could be at home with my kids. And, so it was working. But because it wasn't permanent, that was the part I was focused on. And I remember my husband saying, but Claire, you are a TV presenter. And I remember even kind of catching myself in that moment. So that's where, that kind of negative talk can constantly come, that you're constantly focused on what's not working and you're missing what is. And a positive I've found more recently in midlife is that I've got to a point where that point I mentioned was kind of a cynicism to the whole thing. I'm like, well, it doesn't work. You make these plans and you set these goals and it doesn't work out that way. And I was really quite angry. I call it life coach cynic. And there was a life coach that ended up
Yeah.
coming on the show and giving me a free session. And I mean, I ate him nearly down the phone about how things weren't working. So that was one point I found myself in. But the point I find myself in now in midlife is not wanting to constantly look to the horizon and look at what's next and what's
Yeah.
next, and to really try and be in what I've set up.
Yeah.
But I think when I'm hard on myself, I take a step back from it and I really question what's fueling this. And I think as women in particular, and look, it just because I am a woman, I can't speak for men. I think we can be really hard on ourselves for not doing enough, for not being enough, for not looking as we should. And that used to fuel a lot of my health and wellness endeavors. And I really try and speak out against that. I'm very much anti diet culture because it's a very unmotivating place to start. If you're starting in a place of self loathing that you might not even recognize is self loathing, but if you're
Yeah.
constantly squeezing stuff in the mirror and look at that sticking out and look at that, or, looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, ugh, like that is not going to motivate you to feel at your best because as you said, I followed all these different fads and these Atkins, and I've pushed it to the absolute limit. In the lead up to my wedding, I went absolutely gung ho on a high protein, low carbohydrate diet. I was the strongest I've possibly ever been in the gym and the most consistent. But I wasn't healthy. I didn't necessarily want to meet friends because I was afraid I might, slip up and have a piece of cake. My body fat was so low, I wasn't menstruating anymore. My digestive system was all over the place. So
Wow. Yeah.
I really want to open out that conversation because sometimes when we're hard on ourselves, it means we're not making the right choices because we're not coming from the most positive position that we can. I think anything we should do for ourselves is because we care for ourselves, not the very opposite.
Mm, mm.
Easier
Yeah.
said than done, I know.
Yeah, it is, but it's very topical because there's a lot there in what you're saying. I mean, look, as a man, all I can say is, and I mean, I work with both men and women, but what I could say is, like, men, in my experience, can be equally hard on themselves, but probably in a different context, in a different way. And also, there's not the same social pressure on men in terms of appearance as there is definitely on women. But having said that, I think there's a change almost with the current generation. I can see it with my
Mhm.
own kids where there's a lot more consciousness around body
Mhm.
beautiful, and that brings a lot of different expectations for both boys and men and women. Um, you also in your book, you do talk, there's a chapter dedicated, I think, to the negativity bias, which I think is brilliant. And then also you mentioned the life coach cynic, which again made me laugh because I can relate to it. A couple of questions though, because there's one story you told in the book that I want to come back to because I think it's very important. But before I do that, I wanted to ask about your vision board. Do you still do a vision board, or what's your view on something like that now?
I don't really because I found it it made me be disappointed.
Yeah.
I really did find that. Um and I had hoped to build on family land. And I used to have this nook in mind that would look out at the sea, and that's where I'd sit in the morning. And eh, you know that didn't work out. The planners didn't share my vision. I should have said to them the vision board.
You should have, yeah.
Um, but like we've a beautiful house now,
Yeah,
and things don't work out the way they're meant to. And who knows what the future will bring? And maybe be like, Jesus, I just think sometimes that there's a danger in all of this
yeah,
talk of manifesting and vision boards. And I, I, it's not that I don't think they are helpful tools. And
yeah,
there's even science around manifesting and a mindset. And
yeah,
I mean, anybody knows if you say, I need to buy a new car and you know what, I fancy a red one. All you
yeah,
see is red cars everywhere. There's a lot of where focus goes, energy flows. And
Yeah.
I am all about that. As I said, with taking an aerial view of your life and all of that. But I try not to put too much pressure on myself in that way. I like to let life unfold as it's meant to. And maybe that's the stage of life I'm at. For years, I did all of that. And for years, I thought about, what do I want out of this year? What do I want out of this life? And set those goals. But I just think you need to have a certain amount of flexibility with them. And I'm a hugely ambitious person. I work really hard. But I just think as well, we can often get so focused on our career success that we forget about all the other successes in life. We forget about the
Yeah.
success of having a working and happy relationship, if that's our setup. I forgot to really mark the successes of having kids, because that was my journey and that was something that was important to me. I know that's not important to everybody, and that is completely fair enough. But, I didn't celebrate getting kids sleeping through the night. I didn't celebrate getting kids out of nappies in the same way I put all this pressure on myself to get on TV, to get this, to get that, to get the other thing. So I've kind of tried to take the pressure off that a little bit, and look at it in a little while. It doesn't mean there isn't a vision board bombing around
Yeah.
in my head,
Yeah.
but I found the last one I made, I used to kind of hide it down the back of a um, chest of drawers, and I nearly didn't want to look at it to see what
Yeah.
didn't happen. But
Yeah.
again, is that negativity bias that we're only
Yeah.
looking at that instead of the other stuff?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I can relate to a lot of what you're saying. I mean, very much so. And it's funny, a mentor of mine said to me years ago, which I share with my clients now, because it really hit me hard when they said it's all in relation to what you've been saying, but they just said to me, don't make where you are wrong,
Yeah.
and the mind, if it's left to its own devices, will go, yeah, that's fine, but I want to be over there. I want that. I'm not, and I didn't get what three things on the vision board, even though I've got a great life. So don't make where you are wrong. And I find like that's
Mm.
one thing that I often remember myself, because the mind will go off in a different direction. It also brings me to the story in the book that I've actually heard this from some of my clients as well. So when I read it in your book, I thought, oh wow, like this is something that is becoming way more common. And it was, I think one of your, I think forgive me now, Claire, if I got this wrong, but it was like one of your clients, I think it was a mom, and her daughter said to her, Mom, you're here, but you're never here.
Mm. That is an author in the US, and it was a clip of her that I saw speaking to
Ah,
Oprah.
that's what it was. Okay.
And yeah, that really hit home with me. And it turned out that that lady had been abused as a child, and she had shut that away and gone into autopilot for her whole life. And when her daughter said that, it nearly shocked her back in to the world. And trying to be more present brought all of those memories back up for her, and she subsequently went and sought therapy and help, and now she speaks, but not necessarily from, you might have uncovered trauma, just from a how present are we
Are you?
really
Yeah.
in our lives. And we can all be on autopilot, and it's the way life is. I mean, I hear an awful lot now through working in the wellness world of people just not taking any time for themselves whatsoever. I don't know who I was talking to last week, and they were saying, you know, they would say to women, you need a doctor's appointment for that. And they'd say, oh, I don't have time for that this week. Imagine not having time to make a doctor's appointment for a health issue. And I know there is a lot going on with health anxiety, and people think, oh, look, if I don't look and if I don't meddle, everything will be okay. They don't want to hear bad news. I think people think that often about therapy as well. If I go digging, God knows what'll come up, and I'll feel worse, instead of thinking about, the benefit it could bring to their everyday. But, I was at the launch of a supplement range recently, and it's a morning supplement and evening supplement. And some of the feedback that they've been receiving from customers a lot is that they're really enjoying taking the time for themselves. And we're talking about pouring a sachet into water and drinking it. And
Wow.
people are like really feeling the benefit of that. And,
Well,
that's mad. That's 5 minutes in the morning and 5 minutes in the evening. But the fact that it says, I think the evening one says restore on it, and even that word and that language and that you're doing something just for you. I mean, that's mind blowing to me. And at that same launch, Dr. Mary Ryan was there, and she's a consultant endocrinologist. So she sees a lot of women. She sees men as well, because obviously hormonal health applies to all genders. Um, but a lot of the time she deals with women who come and they are on their knees and their hormones are all askew. And she will say to them, and I reference this in the book, talk me through your day
mm,
or your week.
mm,
And often they're like getting up at 5.
mm,
They might be going for a run because they're training for a marathon or a high rocks or something. And these are all brilliant endeavors,
yeah.
but they're really pushing themselves in something physical. Then they're coming home, they're doing most of everything around the house. So they're doing the lunches, they're getting things ready, they're doing the breakfast, they're getting the kids out the door. Then they're going to high powered jobs.
Mm,
Then they're coming home and they're doing the same. They're eating lunch at their desk. Then they're trying to keep up with their friendship groups. They're
mm,
trying to keep up with they're doing a yoga class or they're doing a meditation or they're doing something else, and they're doing clubs, and they're trying to keep their relationships going as well. So there's date night. They're drinking, bottles of wine every week because they're trying to keep up with that side of life. And we cannot do it all. And it's all outward stuff. It's all giving, 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 giving without giving to themselves, even
but I
for
think I
five
think a lot of
minutes.
people listening to this will be in that exact situation. So if one of your close friends was that, based on your experience, what would you say to them?
I would say, particularly if I'm talking to women, um, I would say take a pause, take a beat. Why are you why are you pushing yourself so hard? What is it that you're trying to prove? And I have to ask myself this question a lot too. And I think as women as well, um, often we of course pit the genders against each other, especially if you are in a male female relationship. And,
Mm,
there's sort of a disservice, I think, to men, that there's this eye roll that, women are doing everything and, these bloody men kind of thing. And I think that's outdated now. And I think it's really unfair on men. And I think as women, yes, perhaps we have a way to go when it comes to equality. But I think as women, we need to relinquish a bit of control. We seem to think that our way is the best way. And I know there are a lot of systems at play that feed into that. I think the fact that maternity leave is mainly taken by women is one of the issues there, because by default you become the house manager, you become the one that knows the baby the best by the very fact that you're with them all of the time. So you start to say, oh no, they don't like being held that way. Oh no, they'd like, and all of a sudden that just becomes the entire house. And often you just sort of pick your battles, I suppose, and you just get on with things. But I've had to really relinquish control and ask for the support that I need. Whether that's bringing in a virtual assistant to help me with work stuff, whether that is, having a cleaner come in once a week, whether that's sitting down with my husband and speaking about how we're going to share up things and how we're going to work up things, whether that's speaking to my bosses about how I work and the way I work. I think it's really important. And again, it has to come with the pause to figure out what is right for you, that
mm,
aerial view of your life. What's working here? How are my energy levels? So I always talk about the 10-minute check-in or even the 5 minute. How am I? How am I really? And I will always map it back. So if it's knackered, what is leading to that? What have you been doing over the last little while? Are you working too hard? Have you been, socializing loads? When was the last time you had a good night's sleep? Are you eating well? Now, sometimes there's chapters in life. There could be a really big project at work that requires all your attention. There's a sick kid, a sick, parent. There can be all different things that necessarily can't be changed in that moment. But I'm talking about the everyday stuff. And even during those big chapters in our life, what are we doing to top ourselves back up? I remember when my dad was very sick in his last few days, and my kids were quite young at the time. They were 5 and 8, and I kind of stayed with my mum a lot at that time. And my husband took over, the home stuff a lot. And I remember in the times that I would be going back to the house from the nursing home where my dad was really on his last days, I would walk the pier. I would just walk the pier just for a moment, just to kind of create a little pause between what was happening there and going home and being present for my kids. And that's just one example of something that was really simple and that was really small and didn't make my dad get better, didn't help necessarily fix the grief that was on the way. It didn't necessarily feed into the roles and responsibilities that I had at home, but it did because it fortified me in the midst of all of that. And I think they're the little choices that we're making. Are we sitting down to eat a decent breakfast that's going to fuel us through the day? Are we stepping away from our computers to sit and have lunch because that's what we need to do to reset ourselves? Are we putting down our phones instead of taking in more of the news of what's happening? And are we just sitting in the garden with a cup of tea or doing a 5-minute meditation? Or it's going to look different to everybody. Are we meeting a friend for a coffee because that's what lights us up? Are we returning to that dance class that we loved because, again, that's going to make our soul sing? They're all the wellness things. It's not about green juices and, strict diets and pushing ourselves to the max. It's little tiny moments, but we're only going to be able to work out what those moments are if we take one for ourselves and ask, what is it that I need?
Beautiful. So you mentioned their soul, and I did want to get to this, the third part of your book. So, okay, what does soul mean to you, and how do you connect with your soul on a practical level?
I really wanted to get into this part because I think it's hard to define, but I think it's equally important. And I think, particularly in Ireland, when we talk about spiritual wellness, we instantly go to religion, or many of us can go to religion.
Mm,
And we have obviously had a very big shift in this country with our relationship with religion. And I say that with the greatest of respect to people who still have their faith. And I see it with my own mum, and it's a huge part of her wellness and her well-being. So my mum has a great faith. It gets her through difficult and challenging times. It's a real kind of backbone to her in life. It is something that sets her up for her day. So my mum gets up every day and does the rosary. So that's like her meditation,
mhm,
her mindfulness, and that really sets her up, as well as connecting with, the church and giving back and that sense of community and going every Sunday. But I think for those of us who have stepped away from organized religion, I think there's a fear of us throwing away the baby with the bathwater and getting rid of three things that I think are really important in life. And it's that sense of community, it's
mm,
that time for reflection, and it's bringing in ritual. As humans, I
mm,
think we really like ritual. And I talk about my dad in the book and me being a teenager saying, I don't want to go to mass anymore, Dad. It's not cool, and I just don't want to go. I was probably about 15 or 16 at the time. And he said, look, I get it. And, it's up to you what you do with religion later in life. But even if you're not into necessarily what's being said, why don't you just take it as a time, which is what he said he did, to just reflect, to just think about the week gone by, think about the week to come. There's candles lit, there's nice music, there's flowers. It's a nice setup. Why not lean into that? And I think there's areas that we can do that don't necessarily have to be in a church or a synagogue where we can do that, although it can easily be done there. And I know means a huge amount to people. But I think even the simple act of just lighting a candle can be so powerful. So at the start of the day, I will light a candle. I hop back into my bed. I'm quite awake. I've splashed water on my bed, and I'll take 10 minutes that are just for me. And that's where my check in comes. For other people, it might be at the end of the day. And again, I light that candle at the end of the day. And that signifies to me the end of the day. And it's now time for wind down. And it's now time to let go of everything and not to really think about what has to be done tomorrow, but just to settle. And again, that's really powerful. And I think that's where spiritual well-being comes in, as well as having a focus on what makes us light up and leaning into that a little bit. And again, that comes back to what I said earlier was really part of our coach training, that everybody knows what it is that they need. So I think we all know what lights us up, and it looks It looks different for everybody. And who are the people that light us up? And when we feel that true sense of joy, what are we doing? It can be in nature. For some people, I feel really lucky for people. I was working a bit there recently with Niall Breslin at the launch of his book and his album, and to see what music means to him and to be able to compose music and have his process his feelings in that way into music, and then to sit at a piano and just lose himself and be in a flow state was just amazing to see. For other people, it's sea swimming, and it's making time to really lean into those things that
Mm.
I think is really important. But through work one day, I was contacted by a company who talk about performance, and they asked me to wear a heart rate variability monitor for 48 hours. And you keep a diary alongside it. And I was in a flow state sitting at my laptop writing my online course. And I think sometimes that's missing, and particularly because you said a lot of people that would listen to this are going to be, business owners or, C-suite executives. We hear so much about how terrible it is, about how hard we're working and how long we're sitting at the computer. And, I'm not saying that it's not important for us to get up and step away. I think I've already said that. But
Mm.
I was in a flow state because I love what I do. And I think if you
Mm.
love what you do, that can
Mm.
be a really positive thing. And so if you're sitting in a job that you hate, I know we all have to make ends meet, and I'm not immune to that either. But
Mm.
to really have a life that you enjoy, and I know that can seem difficult, particularly, in a housing crisis, in a climate crisis, in a cost of living crisis. But you can tweak certain things. And if you have to work in the job that you hate to make ends meet, where else are you finding that joy in life to make your soul sing? Or what steps are you making to move away from that? Because that's certainly something that I have done. And I do think it's important. And it doesn't mean I haven't had challenging moments where I've had money worries and money issues, or worries about what the future might hold, because I've worked for myself for the last 12 years. But it means it's something that I feel I have a certain control over, and being led by your soul a little bit, that inner you, I think is so powerful and so important to our overall well-being.
Mm. Lovely. Lovely. We're coming into the closing lap here, I think, because I want to respect your time, and I really appreciate you sharing everything you shared. Like a lot of it, everything you've said, I really, really resonate with. There's one thing in the book I just thought it'd be nice for you to share as a closeout, which is your take on, I think in the book you call it the holiday you that you can bring back from a holidays. Could you talk a bit about that? I think it'd be a nice way to close out.
Yeah, I think when we go on holidays, we allow ourselves to be a particular kind of person. And look, I totally accept when we're on holidays, there is no work. Particularly if, say, you go on holiday where you're staying in a resort. The sun is shining, you've nothing to do all day except decide where to eat and what sun lounger to sit on. So I get all of that. There's not even a dishwasher to fill. And all of that is really lovely. But it's how you show up on that holiday that I think is something you can actually bring back home with you. We let our shoulders come down a little bit. So, I'll often get in the pool with the kids, or, play the game. We start to get out cards and we start to connect on a different way. I think that's something we can bring into the everyday, a focus on bringing that connection in. You could do it at your own dinner table, any day of the week. You let your shoulders come down when it comes to food choices. And okay, maybe you drink a little bit more on holidays. I'm not suggesting you bring in a glass of wine at every single meal. But
Mm.
I have often found, and I always thought it was very interesting, I've already said I kind of live now without food rules. I really do. It's just become
Mm.
who I am. I don't really have to think about it anymore. But
Mm.
in the old version of me, I'd go away on holidays and I'd throw caution to the wind, and I would just eat what I fancied at the time.
Mm.
And I used to nearly wonder how, I would nearly feel I came home and my clothes were fitting a little bit better. And I really attribute that to the lack of cortisol in my system, the lack of the stress hormone. and to just enjoy your food and to just really tune into what do I fancy right now. And I
Mm.
think people think that means that you're just going to sit and eat 24 bags of crisps or, 16 packets of biscuits. And maybe you will for a few days. And, it can be a complex relationship we have with food. And sometimes it does need support from a professional. But on the whole, our bodies know what we need,
Mm.
and leaning into that, I think, can be a really, really positive thing to do. And also the fact that we are in nature a lot more when we're on holidays and we really appreciate it. We're looking at views, we're taking in the weather, and we're really sitting for that bit longer on balconies and all that. We could bring that in back home. I mean, today is a gorgeous day and
Yeah.
it's just in Dublin, and getting out with the dog earlier, I was like, this is heaven. And just even taking a moment every morning to bring your tea or your coffee outside and listen to the birds singing and take it all in, or even listening to the wind battering the windows and the rain, and feel cozy and warm inside. They're little glimmer moments that sometimes we only give ourselves when we're in a fancy hotel sitting at the fire thinking, isn't this lovely? You can do that in your own home. And the fact that we allow ourselves that lounging time on holiday to read books, to sit and chat for longer, we can bring that into our everyday. I don't know why we don't allow ourselves to read our books only when we're going to bed. And
Yeah.
I don't do it myself. And I kind of question the days where I sit and I say, surely I could be doing something else. But now I really value the power
Mm.
of rest. And why should
Mm.
we only truly rest for 2 weeks of the year? That's a bit sad, isn't it? Out of all of them. So
Absolutely.
yes, we don't have time in a working week and with kids going here, there and everywhere, or whatever your responsibilities are. But we can take moments. If you're really enjoying your book, give yourself an hour to read it on a Sunday and just enjoy it. And all those little things that you allow yourself on holiday, can you bring moments of it? But I think it's how you show up. I remember so many holidays. I'd pack all of these things and the hair straighteners and in the end, you don't really worry about stuff like that because you just feel
Yeah.
so good in the sunshine. Um, and I'd nearly like catch myself in the mirror brushing my teeth or whatever. And I'd be like, there she is. There's me outside of all of the stresses and the worries and the running here, there and everywhere. The slowed down version of me is the real me, or the slowed down version of you is the real you. So why don't you just slow down a little more often and meet that person a little more regularly?
I really like that. The slowed down version of you is the real you. I couldn't agree more with that. Couldn't agree more with that. Well, look, first of all, congratulations on your book, Would You Be Well? With the Shed Press. That's Claire McKenna. Doing fantastically well. I highly recommend it. Like I read and I have read a lot of health and well-being books because I'm interested in that area. Most of them I never finish. And this one I did. Because I just thought it was actually, it's very well grounded. It's good common sense. As you know, I've given it to some clients and the feedback from them has kind of given me back the same comments in terms of they just thought, I think they were half expecting it to be full on up at 5 a.m. Brian Johnson stuff, who's also mentioned in your book. But it's not, it's just very balanced. And I think it's something that the information you have in it is very wise. So congratulations. Claire, if people
Thank
want
you,
to,
Shane. You've been
you're-
so supportive and I really, really, really appreciate that.
not at all. No, I'm happy to support something that I know is going to make a difference. If people want to get in touch with you, if they want to connect with you as as a speaker or as an integrative health coach, what should they do? Is there a specific website you like them to go to?
I have wouldyoubewell.ie. I'm Claire McKenna Presents on Instagram and Claire McKenna on LinkedIn, and I spell my name without the I, like the county,
Without the I.
Clare. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Clare. Okay. Very good. All right. Well, Claire, thank you very much.
Thank you. I've loved this chat. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Claire McKenna. A couple of things that I particularly resonated with was the first point being at the very beginning of our conversation, we were talking about, the slowed down version of you is the real you. And we were talking about initially in the context of health, but ultimately I'm seeing this myself, even with high performers, leaders, anybody looking to get the best out of themselves and even the people around them, is that in a way, this busyness, and it's not just being busy in your life externally, it's the internal busyness is really at an epidemic level. And I think it's really, really important to kind of, even just to have that time that I don't have time to go see the doctor. I don't have time to see a dentist is a big flag that you're going in the wrong direction. If you haven't got time to look after yourself, you're the goose that lays the golden egg in every context, health, work, life. And I think that's a really, really common sense approach and point. But as we know, common sense is not always that common, particularly with the busy, busy, busy world. So I think for a lot of people, the issue isn't capability or even knowledge. It's just misdirected effort, too much business internally, and just a lack of pause and giving yourself that chance to slow down. And ultimately, if you don't, I think it doesn't end well. And then I think that point that Claire made about, most people are solving the wrong problem, that they're solving for appearance over their experience or how they feel. And I think that central shift that was on her journey from moving from how do I look to how do I feel? And that's such, I think, a significant mind shift, because when you're optimizing, and that word is so prevalent at the moment, I've almost come to dislike it, but when you're optimizing for appearance, it leads to restriction, it leads to stress, it leads to unsustainable behaviors, it leads to not feeling probably the way that you're built to feel. But if you focus more on feeling in a healthy way, that generally tends to lead to better energy, more consistent and better long-term outcomes. So I just think that is such an important point. And if that kind of filter of appearance versus feeling is off, like we all like to look good, who doesn't? But if it gets to an obsessive nature or level, then that's not going to be good. And I think that's something that I thought was quite profound. I've shared Claire's book with several clients, and a couple of them came back to say that they really were enjoying it, and what they enjoyed about it was the fact that it was very easy to read and very holistic and just really common sense. And in a world of kind of health fads and trends and obsession, that's a very refreshing voice to add to the countless books in the health area. So if you're looking for something that's an easy read, but also a very helpful read, I really recommend Claire's book, Would You Be Well? That's it for this week. Ciao for now.